Tonight we have a bit of a special event, and I know I say that every time, but obviously we have a table here to prove it. Tonight we're going to have a conversation between Todd Gannon and Joe Day. The two of them will be discussing Todd's new book, Reyner Banham and the Paradoxes of High Tech, which was released late last year by the Getty Research Institute. And I just want to mention, I think you saw that there's some representatives from the Wexner Center who are outside, and they'll be selling the book for 20% off for $45, and Todd has also confirmed that he's willing to sign some of those if you're interested. So now I trust that most of you in the room here know Todd, who's returned as our architectural section head at the beginning of this academic year. And I say returned, of course, because Todd earned 2 degrees from the Ohio State before going to Los Angeles, where he earned his PhD at UCLA, and stuck around, most recently teaching history theory and design courses at SCI-Arc. But one of the reasons why I think this conversation should be particularly interesting tonight is that Todd is someone who's able to wear a few hats, and while over the last 6 or so months most of us have become familiar with Todd as a teacher, you might be a little bit less familiar with Todd and his work as a scholar, which is really the foreground of tonight's discussion. So Todd will introduce the book that he and Joe will be discussing, I think. But I just wanted to briefly mention, let's say, one more hat, which is, I think, a kind of third hat that's lurking somewhere between the teacher and the scholar, and that would be the designer. One of the kind of distinctive aspects of Todd's scholarship that I think you'll notice in this book and in the discussion tonight is that he pays particular attention to those aspects of architecture which are traditionally maybe less frequented by scholars and more familiar to designers. And by this I mean specifically the kind of strange space between ideas and objects where the majority of a designer's time is often spent. But this is, let's say, his third hat as a kind of designer also starts to imply that maybe hats are kind of the wrong idiom altogether. Because Todd's ability to think critically about the ways in which thoughts and things impose themselves on one another, evidenced, for example, by our source books here at the Knowlton School, or maybe by Todd's more recent interest in figures like Timothy Morton, seem to suggest that a clean parceling of ideas from things, or the agencies of designers and scholars, is not only made more difficult, but maybe not entirely desirable. So I'll borrow from one of Todd's recent texts and say that if instead of stable hierarchies or hats between modes of expertise, such as theory and design or ideas and objects, Todd's scholarship suggests something like a loop in which conventionally separate things are made to fold back onto one another so that architecture might encounter itself in unexpected ways. Now, one of these unexpected encounters is that if we were to follow this loop for long enough, I suspect that we'd eventually run into the similarly hatless Joe Day, who is our second speaker for the evening. Joe is joining us from Los Angeles, where he leads the practice Deegan Day design, as well as from SCI-Arc, where he teaches both design and theory and serves on SCI-Arc's board of trustees. Now, I was really excited when Todd invited Joe because among many other accomplishments, Joe is also the author of a fantastic 2013 book, Corrections and Collections, Architecture for Art and Crime, which examines the parallel boom of 2 types of institutional architectures in the second half of the 20th century. Now, I think it's not too much of a stretch to suggest that this book also performs a kind of trick in which 2 distinct and seemingly unrelated things, museums and prisons, are brought to bear upon one another through their mutual imbrication with concepts like minimalism, seriality, and regimentation. In other words, Joe's book gives us something like a loop. And in fact, the creative work of Deegan Day often relies on Joe's insistence on seeing relationships between ideas as sites for organizational innovation, or in other words, seeing disciplinary research as a problem of design. Deegan Day develops intricate diagrams, which they call arrays, which are both critical overviews of art, architecture, and their histories, as well as design instruments for locating their creative ambitions within the field at large. And I'd encourage you to look at a show that they held at SCI-Arc, I think 2 years ago, also called Arrays, in which it's an incredible show in which there's over 30 of these diagrams which they've been producing over the last 20 years. So this is all to say that in 2 very different ways, what we encounter in Todd and Joe's respective works seems to be a predilection for replacing hats with discursive loops, in which the discipline's own specific techniques and conventions fold back on themselves, and architecture catches architecture by surprise. So with that, let's welcome Todd Gannon and Joe Day, who have come together to talk about a theorist, Reyner Banham, who is famous for his love of ostentatiously large hats.
So we had a whole issue with these microphones last time. Are we okay? Good. So we're not going to be able to top that. That was fantastic. Thank you, Curtis. I think we can just end it now.
Maybe better.
Yeah. But thank you for being such an astute reader of both of us. I mean, I think it's this is a weird talk. I guess it's funny that I don't do this sort of thing very often, like try to promote the books. Some of you may have been around here long enough to know or remember I gave a talk on this book while it was in development here at the school maybe 5 years ago. And I thought that it was, I didn't want to just do the book talk again, even though many of you maybe haven't seen it. But I guess it's online, you can go and read it, or you can go watch it, whatever. But I thought it would be more fun, frankly, to have a friend who knows Banham's work probably as well as I do, or better, and who knows me in a way that I always find a little bit surprising and disarming, frankly. And so we're not totally sure where the conversation is going to go, but we thought we'd talk a little bit about the process of writing, about the process of research, and also, you know, the content of the book. I mean, so the book, in a very kind of short nutshell, really it centers around another book that doesn't exist. So at the very end of his life, Reyner Banham was working on a monograph on high tech. The name of that book was Making Architecture, The Paradoxes of High Tech. And unfortunately, Banham was diagnosed with cancer in the summer of 1987, which was, he was about a year into the preparatory work for this book. By March of 1988, he was dead. And so the book was never completed. He left in the archive a draft introduction, which we were able to include in this book here. And if you look at the way Banham used to write his books, often he would work through a lot of the ideas that structured the arguments in magazine and journal essays. And it appears, based on the table of contents which he left behind, which I now realize that would have been an interesting document to have. We don't have it, sorry. But if you look at Banham's table of contents, you begin to kind of piece together at least the rough sketch of what he was trying to do with that book. So a lot of what I did was try to figure out, I began by trying to figure out what Banham would have said had he lived long enough to say it. And what happened in that process is that it became clear that the story was bigger than high tech in a way. That what Banham was really writing about was modernism, and whether modernism, or how to make sure modernism had a future, what that future might be, could that future be influenced by scholarship? And so those are, you know, the kind of themes that live in the back, in the kind of conceptualization of the book, I guess. Just to kind of orient you a little bit, the book...
move around a little so that it stays on screen.
Yeah, you know, it kind of... Now I have to remember what No, if you go back to the content, you see, so it begins kind of chronologically. In many ways, Banham's life as a scholar, you know, he began in the 1950s working on, let's say, you know, high modernism of the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. At the same time, he was part of the group of English architects, or British architects, involved in the hatching of the new brutalism. And what becomes clear is many of the ideas that kind of fired high-tech architecture, the work of people like Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, Renzo Piano, Grimshaw, etc., really was that work was really wrestling with a lot of the same kinds of ideological questions that the brutalists were wrestling with. So the book begins, as Banham's career did in many ways, with brutalists, and it uses the development of high tech as a way to look at different aspects of Banham's life. So the book, in a way, is trying to wear two hats. In one hand, it's a kind of it's a scholarly study of Banham as a historian. On the other hand, it glances often at the history of high tech. So maybe that makes it a little complicated. Maybe it makes it more interesting. I'll let you decide. But I just wanted to give that little bit of backstory as to why we're here, and then I don't know what you do with that.
I do with that. Let me say first, thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be at OSU. This is, to be honest, a bit of a mythical institution for me, teaching with Todd for quite a few years, and Jeff Kipnis, and a bunch of colleagues that all of a sudden all seem to be running schools, like Todd and David Erdman and Heather Rivera at UCLA. I feel like I've come just to see just to see how things take shape here. And it's been a wonderful day on not enough sleep, so I apologize if I'm a little bit off kilter. I was thinking as Todd was speaking, the paradigm for my talk tonight should probably be Penn and Teller. But
Which one do I get to be?
You started talking, so I get to be the other guy. Actually, what I wanted to bring with me from Los Angeles was a little bit of what has been actually a really sustaining friendship with Todd over the last 5 or 10 years. And it was a fantastic, and thank you for the kind introduction. I think you touched on something that's really central to our lives in architecture, and not necessarily a common paradigm in our field, but we really like wearing a few hats. In fact, I usually wear a hat and wish I had today. And trading between design and criticism and teaching, and to a certain degree diagramming, which in my case brokers between those, is a way of operating in our field that I think actually was once considerably more common than it is now, but that I think might be valuable to generations in school right now in a way that it wasn't necessarily as crucial for the last 20 years. I think for the last 20 years there were, in the projects of the digital turn and globalization, big collective endeavors that people could enter into in a lot of different ways and sort of take on bits and pieces of, maybe in a way as the CM generations did post-war modernism. But I think we're entering a different time, and I think being able to talk about how architecture can answer the times and being able to think about it in a few different valences is valuable. And Todd and I got to know each other teaching at SCI-Arc and talking about work, and actually largely through a discussion of Reyner Banham, who, when we first met, Todd was completing a dissertation on. And so in a sense, I've read this book, arguably I've read it twice, but they were two very different books and they differed in important ways. Todd's dissertation was called Theory and Design in the Last Machine Age, a riff on Banham's early Theory and Design in the First Machine Age. And it was a remarkable study of Banham and his world. And there were chapters, we were talking a bit about brutalism and how brutalism is echoed formidably in the new volume, but quite a bit in that one on the independent group and on Banham's early intellectual development in the UK, and how he brought a particular point of view on the world to the United States and especially to Los Angeles. My fascination with Reyner Banham actually picks up on that geographical note. I found Reyner Banham when I was in school on the East Coast and desperately homesick for Los Angeles, and a professor of mine recommended that I pick up Los Angeles architecture of the four ecologies, and I ended up citing my senior thesis in his picture of the 10405 Cloverleaf.
And what he's leaving out is that he also wound up writing the introduction to the latest edition of the four ecologies. So Joe's interest in Banham is more than just, it's more than amateur.
Well, I would actually say this, that my interest in Banham is precisely amateur, and I'm comfortable with that. But I'm shaking too much to too much coffee. There we go. And this is, yeah, so this is where my piece of the puzzle picks up. I moved back to Los Angeles in the early 90s, actually about 4 years after Reyner Banham had left the city and passed away in the early 80s. And it was still very much his city. Charles Jenks was still teaching periodically, his dissertation student. And more generally, I think criticism in Los Angeles, the whole way of discussing the city owed quite a bit to Reyner Banham. In the early 2000s, I got a call from UC Press, Berkeley, and a friend of a friend had recommended that they talk with me about an introduction for the new volume. There are a few important things to know about Los Angeles architecture of the four ecologies. And we'll talk a little bit about the four ecologies, but a very important thing to know about it is that there's already a fantastic introduction to LA A4E by Anthony Vidler, which is also included in this volume. You get them all if you get this one. But Anthony Vidler's look at Los Angeles, at Banham's Los Angeles, was through the lens of a kind of noir detective. He took the book as this sort of, almost as a crime scene that needed explanation. So Vidler tracked down, for example, how Mary Banham had assembled the many maps that illustrate the book. He went through Banham's, actually, I think he studied how Reyner Banham learned to drive and therefore to navigate LA, and how he got his sense for the city that led to his development of his theory of four ecologies. Vidler's introduction is a fantastic explanation of how a book like this comes together. And one of the things he points out is that the book is dedicated to Cedric Price, one of the formative members of Archigram, who had asked Banham to explain Los Angeles to him in the late 1960s. So it's published in 1971. What they wanted for Los Angeles in 2009 was an introduction that discussed a bit of what had happened since LA Architecture of the Four Ecologies, and that frankly was addressed to an audience much like all of you, that might be younger architects who might be thinking about studying architecture in Los Angeles or something else that might be interested in the city. An introduction for students in many respects, and I was thrilled to have the opportunity. In fact, thrilled and terrified. So what I'm showing to the right was the diagram I did the day after I got this phone call. And I was trying to think, I'll look at the four ecologies and see if they make sense anymore. But like, if I were going to try to chart LA, how would I do it? And in the 2000s, I would say it almost makes more sense to read my city in terms of a kind of quadratic equation that would look a little bit like this. That would polarize sunshine and noir, which are famously tied up in the LA art world in terms of finish fetish and abject art, either extreme of the kind of temperamental spectrum of contemporary art, as well as a notion of LA as both a fantastic projection of what the world might look like at some point. Certainly for a lot of the 20th century, LA was was the template for what American auto-governed cities could look like, versus a notion of realism that had become very important in the scholarship in Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s, with Mike Davis and Ed Soja's postmodern geography sort of unpacking the actual dynamics of the city's formation, and really actually historicizing the city in a pretty emphatic fashion in those years. So just to give you a sense for how I often work, I try to find polarities that have, that seem to work, set them opposite one another, and then look at what the quadrants yield. What could survive between those? And in this case, between sunshine and fantasy, Disneyland certainly made sense. Between fantasy and noir, Blade Runner, I'm teaching a course now at SCI-Arc called Blade Runner, LA 1980 to 2020. I think that's an easy case to make. Between noir and realism, I think Chinatown was an important watershed, the movie about the Mulholland water grab that made Los Angeles possible. And actually, my fourth quadrant was the toughest in some ways. Between Sunshine and Noir, I really think the whole series of case study houses that set up a different discussion of modern architecture in the post-war years as Richard Neutra and Schindler, who were sort of Frank Lloyd Wright's major well, they were apprenticed to him briefly, but his, as their rivalry was starting to open up into new possibilities, I think LA gives you something else. From this, I'm showing this, Todd, because I want to go back to your table of contents and try to do this a little bit. But this is a breakdown of how Los Angeles architecture of the four ecologies operates rhetorically. And it's important that it's both a very clear and incredibly obscure structure for a book. When you look at the table of contents, what jumps out at you first in the right column are where he identifies his four ecologies, which would be, and they move roughly from west-east, from the ocean's edge in suburbia, through the foothills, plains of Id, which spread between those two and themselves support Autopia, or the freeway, and it's more than just the freeway system, but the automotive infrastructure of the city. So on the first glance, this seems like a book that makes perfect, that sets up its challenges and takes them on in series. But as you delve into them, and I think this is important for talking both about the material you were wrestling with, Todd, Banham actually oscillates between all of these questions incessantly. He won't let go of any one to clarify another. He talks about something specific to one that then ends up a lens on the other three. I think as you go through Los Angeles, which frankly is probably the easiest of Banham's books, you see an interesting and very complicated way of creating what Anthony Vidler termed a freeway history, or recursive kind of architectural writing, in which one cycles through and around an idea a number of times to try to clarify it. And this idea of recursion became really sort of central to me in my discussion of Banham's work. That I think Reyner Banham is important. I think we are still sitting here talking about Reyner Banham, in part because Reyner Banham and his counterpart, Colin Rowe, advocated two very different modes of thinking about architecture and writing about it. And if Colin Rowe was a fundamentally recombinant thinker who looked at architecture through a lens of cubism and collage and how you bring disparate fragments together to make sense of a new whole, I think Banham spent his career trying to find a counterpoint to that method. And his counterpoint was a looping, as you put it so nicely, or a recursion, a system of recursion that would pull through an idea a number of times to clarify it, as perhaps unwittingly. I hope I've just done. This was the quad for Todd. This is Todd's quad, and this was when Todd gave me theory and design in the last machine age. I was both flattered and intimidated to be handed a dissertation. I am more of a groupie to my PhD friends than their peer. We were talking about this today, and I hope this future for some of you. Our field has become much more. There are far more serious scholars in our field than there were even as we were entering into it. I was entering into it 25 or 30 years ago. What was once, and certainly in Banham's case, in Banham's time, and Charles Moore gets a PhD basically in art history to open up the possibility of a PhD in architecture in the United States, and open what has become a kind of floodgate of really serious scholarship in our field. But it's not false modesty that has me wanting to play amateur in this conversation, because I think actually it's through a kind of enlightened amateurism that the practitioners in our field will actually capitalize on some of the most valuable scholarship that's been produced in the last 20 years. So when Todd handed me his dissertation, I went through it and I tried to kind of develop a system of polarities that might start to make sense of it. I should add here, parenthetically, that my son is named Reyner Avo Day. So my homage to Reyner Banham had, at that point, taken a much more concrete and straightforward form, and Todd's book seemed unbelievably petty. But we talked about it, and actually
easier and less time-consuming to make a person.
I won't say more. I won't. Actually, it was a nice, as an aside, now I know two boys named Reyner in Los Angeles for Reyner Banham, and Mary Banham collects pictures of his namesake, so if any of you choose to go that route, you should send pictures away. This is that diagram cleaned up and after some review with Todd, and I want to go through it a little bit with you because it relates back, I hope, Todd, to your table of contents and the way you've started to unpack the question of the high-tech relative, the question of the high-tech and whether for Banham high-tech was going to become an inclusive term or one in a spectrum of terms that started to make sense of technology and engineering as he understood it in advanced engineering in architecture. So what's remarkable, I think, what's one of the really remarkable things about Todd's scholarship around Banham is how he takes the relatively generic and often sort of lazy use of the term technology in architecture and starts to really develop a rigor for looking at it. And one of the things he notices early in Banham's writing is a distinction Banham draws between two persona of the engineer. So there are engineers that design needed products, that are involved in industrial design and design things we need. There are also, and this was a term relatively new to me, and it turns out a relatively newly invented term, the boffin. Am I close on pronunciation? We'll go with boffin. Boffin. We've been discussing how French or English the pronunciation of that term should be. A boffin is indeed a specialized expert. And a specialized expert often, someone who may actually be involved in the skunk works for developing a solution to a huge problem, in which case it would stand for the acronym.
Back office intelligence is one of the supposed etymologies. I can unpack the boffin thing for a second.
Please.
So somewhere mid-1970s, Banham finds himself in an argument with his protege, Charles Jenks. And the argument has to do, in the big scale of things, with Modernism, which Banham promoted, the continuation of a certain legacy of 1930s kinds of production, and postmodernism, which Jenks was working very hard to advance in the field. And from that, there's several steps that get unpacked in the book, but from that they arrive at Claude Lévi-Strauss's distinction between the engineer and the bricoleur. And so in The Savage Mind, Lévi-Strauss talks about these two modes of looking at the world. Western culture he typically associates with the engineer. The engineer is someone who makes everything custom. The engineer invents solutions to every problem, and everything's kind of custom made and precise and deliberate. Whereas the bricoleur works with whatever fragments are available, as Robin Middleton put it. The bricoleur just kind of, MacGyver would be the sort of American version of the bricoleur. Like, doesn't matter what the problem is, a paper clip, a jar of peanut butter, and some tape will get you out of whatever bind you're in. And this fight, so they have this fight, and Jenks is on the side of the bricoleurs, as Jenks has developed his theory of ad hocism, which is another kind of collagist practice, proto-postmodernist. And he sets up Banham as the straw dog. And he says, Banham and his engineers and all of his techie stuff, they're doing it wrong, and the bricoleurs are doing it right. And they have this fight in the letters pages of the Architectural Review, if I remember correctly. And Banham comes along, and he doesn't defend the engineers so much as explode the entire argument. It's like, if you look at any practice, regardless of how collagist or scientific you may be, everything is working out of recombinations of existing pieces. Like, everybody works from the catalog in some way, and so everybody, in a certain sense, is a bricoleur, and it's a kind of meaningless or unproductive comparison. At the same time, he then kind of turns around and he gets very excited about this British history of the boffin. And the boffin is the kind of tinkerer in the garage, you know, the guy that fixes his toaster rather than buys a new one. You know, this kind of a character that kind of works on his own, kind of rigging things up as he goes. And the boffin as a character, Banham doesn't really bring him in the conversation at that time, but I brought it into the text as a way to kind of distinguish two modes of high tech in a way. That high tech, on one hand, was the sort of super full custom engineering kind of version. But if you really look at somebody like Richard Rogers or Peter Cook, for instance, you have this kind of tinkering mentality where you'll take a little piece of this and a little piece of that, put it together, and invent a solution to the problem. And the boffin seemed to be a way out of this binary showdown between the engineer and the bricoleur. That the boffin kind of held both sides of the equation in suspension. That the boffin was happy to you know, custom design things, but at the same time happy to just kind of make it up as he went along. And it seemed to be representative of a theme that happens in the book, which is the idea of paradox. That Banham often seemed to work through these binaries that you're describing. But the binary, he worked very hard, particularly in his argument of high tech, to hold those binaries in suspension. Right? That high tech was both traditional and technologically motivated. That high tech was both forward-looking and backward-looking. And these kind of paradoxical constructs that Banham would repeatedly return to are really a big part of this, and the boffin was the kind of personification of that, you might say.
I wonder, so would Q in
Yes.
James Bond?
Q in James Bond is the kind of prototypical boffin. So the word itself comes out of post-war British military culture. It generally refers to the Q type guy. So again, it's thought that it's an acronym for back office intelligence, but it's, you know, these kind of military men working on secret, technologically advanced military projects, but it's the absent-minded professor in a militarized technological context, in a way.
Do you think with the, I'm wondering, Todd, and as you were talking about it, I think this is often the case that these dyads need to become triads, and the bricoleur, the boffin, and the engineer, that it's more a question of triangulation, but I wonder also if it's triangulation with a kind of temporality to it, or I wonder if it's temperament or temporality that matters, and maybe it is a question of attitude. The bricoleur is usually, I mean, the bricoleur is associated more directly with fine art, with assemblage, and with the whole collection of collage-based practices in the 20th century. It's associated with a kind of sincere effort to build or externalize one's world by reassembling fragments to show how that world takes shape.
Right.
You know, the bricoleur in my Los Angeles frame of reference would be Simon Rodia and the Watts Towers. The Watts Towers are a prime example of that mode of work. And both, so if you have Q and you have Rodia, you have two makers who are very much at odds with what would generally be perceived to be a more mainstream and institutionally sanctioned practice in engineering, which requires intense training.
And well, I now realize Curtis is a kind of version of this. I mean, the guy that can build a Volkswagen out of pieces of Volkswagens. You know, I mean, the logic of being able to, that I can acquire enough pieces to build it up into a car. There's a version of that, I think, in Curtis. So I'm going to loop you back into the conversation.
And I mean, and I barely know you, but I think, I mean, in that case, it's a nice unification of the two terms, because actually the bricoleur is taking a Boffin's challenge. You want the thing you presumably want the Volkswagen to take you somewhere and not become an Ed Kienholz sculpture, or maybe not.
But I think that the whole reason to bring this into the conversation, and it does get unpacked, I think, a little bit more coherently in the book, maybe. But one of the problems that Banham was really invested in analyzing was, what is the place of the architect in the world? What is an architect's job? Who does the architect speak to? And one of the things that Banham realized, and you see this all through his text from the 1950s to the 1980s, that he's constantly struggling with the number of audiences, with the number of constituencies that any architect needs to address. So there are, when architects talk to each other, they wear one kind of hat and speak one dialect. When they talk to clients, they speak a very different dialect. When they're speaking to, when they're solving problems of pressing societal or humanitarian concern, like we need a space that's going to keep the rain out and the heat in and accommodate human life, Banham finds generally that architects do a bad job at that conversation. When architects talk about the problems that are internal, problems of style, problems of disciplinary taste, that they do a little bit better. And so Banham, in many ways, was trying to train architects to speak to their constituencies better, and also speak to each other better, and break down these kind of hierarchies between these two modes of address. And so the figure of the Boffin, again, for me, it was a kind of maker that wasn't so conventionally determined by tradition, that the Boffin was familiar with both sides of the argument, but was also able to kind of operate in ways that neither side was able to do as well, you might say. And so I think we're making more out of the Boffin than was made out of this. But we spent more words here than I spent in the book talking about Boffins. But it's an important figure, I think, because I had this hunch somehow that it mattered, and it solved a lot of problems for me intellectually.
Let me tip into these are two pairings that occur in the book, and in particular, Todd discusses them in a sort of an ingenious way in mid text, but they're introduced actually in Reyner Banham's Lost text, which is included in this volume as well, worth the $45 alone. Banham's essay High Tech and Advanced Engineering hadn't been published. Todd can give us a little more background there. But what I wanted to kind of draw our attention to quickly, because I'm hoping it will clarify and let us move on from the Boffin discussion. He sets up a comparison of high tech and advanced engineering by looking at two pairs of examples. The first drawn from industrial design, and the second from architecture. These are the two. So above we have a Solomon ski boot and the molten cycle that Reyner Banham famously is riding in that opening scene, and it becomes increasingly iconic in his life. He argues that these two objects are fundamentally, while both evidence of humankind's advances in being able to make better and better and more efficiently engineered objects, they arise out of two very, very different sentiments and two different sets of ambitions. And I'll come back to the
But just before we do that, just very briefly, this slide really encapsulates for Banham, and this is why he uses it as his prime example. This is the problem that any writer of the history of high tech has to solve. That all four of these objects are considered high tech. Yeah. And he immediately sees that they don't go together very easily. And so the way he describes the pairing is that the boot and the Porsche building are a kind of international style, have an international style lineage in a way, and that they are primarily style. that the boot is fairly conventional, the building is fairly conventional, but they're styled in the language of modernity. His argument for Foster's Renault building on the right and the Molten cycle is that these two are driven by performance, right? That the wheels are half the size of a regular bicycle wheel because you want to be able to fold it, the hinges happen in a certain way. So he makes an argument, and similarly, the tensile structural system of Renault is, in Banham's argumentation, determined by the forces of gravity and the strength of materials and all of those things. And so, for Banham, high tech has to hold in suspension these two qualities. On one hand, style, and on the other hand, performance. And if you go too far to either side, you're missing something about high tech. So the real struggle, again, is kind of holding this binary in suspension. How does one invent a description of a body of work that is sufficiently supple as to accommodate all of these very disparate things, but at the same time sufficiently coherent and clear that it means something? And so that was really the struggle, the struggle of the historian to accommodate that.
So my theory, my theory is that style for Banham is often a perversion of performance.
Yes.
That in fact the specific ways that those two objects sort of rose to the forefront had to do with their eccentricities, that they are in fact both Boffin products. And he talks clearly about the Knowlton bike in those terms, and as Todd said, the perversion of performance in that bicycle is simply the idea of reducing the diameter of a tire by half, and therefore being able to quarter the storage space that it requires when you're not riding it. It isn't a question of how well it rides. How well it rides has been hotly debated ever since they made it onto the road.
There's no debate. It's a bad bicycle.
What jumped out at me, and honestly, this is the one discovery of the last week I think a novel discovery broached here for the first time, was that I was looking at that Salomon boot, and he discusses it. Banham discusses that in 1987 or 88 as a generic ski boot, as the kind of ski boot you would rent at any ski resort you happen to go to. And in 1987, he happened to be correct. For 3 years, rear entry ski boots were in fact the norm, but they were an incredible aberration in terms of the development of high performance ski boots. If you are a half serious skier, you may have a very faint memory of those from the 70s and 80s, but they went away. The reason they were invented, and they were actually invented by the Hansen family, a patent that was purchased later by Salomon when the Hansens, Boffins, all couldn't keep their business running, was that a rear entry ski boot was simply more comfortable to put on. It wasn't necessarily a better boot to ski in, it probably was worse. But ski boots are a pain in the ass to get on and off your feet, and these aren't. By hinging them that way, they're easy to take on and off, and they for a few years in the 1980s, that ease of use trumped their actual performance in the act of skiing. And my theory on Reyner Banham is that he was drawn almost ceaselessly to examples of examples of perversity in performance. And that it's in that perversity that one starts to see their singularity and often their kind of architectonic viability.
Yeah.
So that the Renault building, actually this is to show that the market has proven Banham very right in terms of how these two objects have fared historically. You can spend $16,000 on a serious Knowlton bike, still very much in production, and a vintage Salomon boot. Actually, 40 wasn't the lowest bid I could find on those boots. And all of Salomon's current line is more conventionally like a climbing boot for the last 400 years, something you would enter like an ordinary boot. But I think from Banham's point of view, that singularity of purpose, the redefining of purpose, and thus a performance away from the normative parameters of performance is really important. I think maybe even more important than the argument about generic engineering that he makes, actually, I think, an error on the Solomon ski boot, and very convincingly in terms of this Porsche, the Porsche Center.
Right. Well, I mean, here, this is Banham. This is where Banham, the tastemaker, is in a bit of a quarrel with Banham, the historian. So in his comparison of these two, so here, this is the high-tech problem again. High-tech has to be both of these things. He clearly prefers Foster to Dewhurst Haslam. But he understands that high-tech must have a place for Dewhurst. And he really kind of struggles with this. He realizes that there's much more to Renault than, like, this is clearly not the most efficient way to design a building in terms of cost, in terms of ease of building, they're both equally styled. And Banham prefers the style, he seems to prefer the style of Renault to the style of Porsche, which he sees as maybe a little bit retrograde. You see his style preferences much more in his essays than in his scholarly work. And a big part of what's, I think, both productive and enjoyable in Banham's scholarship of high tech is the struggle to figure out what is the proper aesthetic descriptive vocabulary for something like Foster. So at the end of the day, Foster is still within the architectural canon, is still part of what we do. Banham is kind of often high-fived by various practitioners for being so comfortable with dismissing architecture. Like, architecture's too slow, it's too old, it can't quite do what it's supposed to do. We all remember the famous closing to Theory and Design of the First Machine Age, where he says, what architecture realized in the 1930s was that if one wanted to run with technology, you realize very quickly you're running with a fast crowd. And in order to keep up, you may have to shed, like the futurists did, the very professional garments that identify you as an architect, right? So from the beginning of Banham's writing, I think I got that quote close. How did I do, Jackie? But from the beginning,
that quote.
Huh?
You got to back up.
It's in there somewhere. But from the beginning, Banham is sort of torn. He's committed to architecture as a discipline. He's equally committed to performance as a cultural imperative. And he sees the dissonance between those two things. And so at the beginning of his life, he invents a concept that he calls une architecture autre, an other architecture. This is something he borrows from art autre, with the art of people like Dubuffet, Palozzi, Henderson, his friends in the international, or sorry, what do they call it? The international group?
The independent.
The independent group, those guys. But at first he says, architecture, like we got to get out from under all of these conventions. We have to get out from under classical symmetry, conventional coherence, like all. It's almost an adolescent reaction against the kind of the apparently oppressive disciplinary conventions of conventional design. But as Banham matures, he realizes that's a bad idea. That we kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater if we do that. And so his work on high tech, he's trying to find a much more subtle version of that argument, where it's not architecture as a closed and kind of an anachronistic thing versus design, which actually solves the problems that we have in the world, but rather can we find a way through architecture that accommodates both halves. And what he comes up with at the end of his life is what he calls an other modernism. And so the distinction between une architecture autre and other tradition in modern architecture is the way he often says it. He said it in a bunch of different ways, and he never kind of nailed it down. assume he would have in the book. But this other tradition is basically Banham bifurcating the history of modern architecture. That there's one trajectory that basically comes out of Nicholas Pevsner, travels forward through the international style, and winds up at buildings like the Porsche building. There's another tradition in modern architecture that really begins with Gideon, moves forward through the constructivists, through Foster, and produces high tech, in kind of high style high tech, you might say. So he tries to, he says that high tech has to accommodate both of these traditions. And it's a very fine line he has to walk as a historian to be able to do this. And sometimes he kind of oscillates and says, maybe high tech is not architecture after all. Maybe it's some other thing, and maybe we need to develop a vocabulary. If we're to be true to this sort of stuff, maybe we need to get out from under architecture altogether. He was clearly uncomfortable with that as a position. And every time he walks to that edge, argumentatively, he always backs up. He's like, we could throw out architecture. No, we really, but I want architecture. So in his famous essay on archigram in 1965, in Design Quarterly, he says, we don't want form to follow function into oblivion. So he compares Cedric Price and archigram. He says Cedric Price is really fantastic, but the unfortunate thing about this, the Fun Palace, is that it will disappear. Like there's no there. There's no visual component. Architecture requires that visual component. And so in a sense, archigram wins the showdown with Cedric Price, because archigram understands how to maintain an image. And so, the image quality of these two buildings, Banham is really concerned with. So, at the end of his career, it becomes clear that Banham is much more conventional than he is often made out to be. That he was much more willing to condone a certain anachronism, that he was much more committed to tradition than simply technology. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the book, or tried to do as I wrote the book, was to find a way to hold that tension together in the way that Banham did, or to demonstrate how hard it was for Banham to try to give each side its due without compromising either architecture or performance.
But it seems like there's a radicality in his inclusion.
Yes.
In his inclusiveness there. That I think in the course of his life, earlier in his life, he took sides more emphatically, and often he took the more. I think he tried almost uniformly to take the more technologically avant-garde side of any argument within the field. Later in his life, he starts to see. Later in his life, as I think you map out really beautifully, he starts to see the disciplinary consequences of jettisoning the discussion of architecture when you talk about technology. And I wonder actually if I could set up finally something like a question to the author. Todd, will you talk a little bit, and I think it's fleshing out this point a bit, that your last two chapters are architecture beyond building and building beyond architecture. And could you talk a little bit just about how the two compare, how they feed off one another?
Well, this was, it really has to do with this distinction between kind of style and performance in a way. If we accept that architecture and building are not the same thing, which I think we have to, I think it's quite easy to demonstrate that just as you cannot reduce literature to books, you cannot reduce architecture to buildings, right? Architecture is more than buildings, just as literature is more than books. And one of the struggles that Banham really works with quite beautifully in his late essays, and in a book, his only monograph on the archigram member Ron Herron, he looks at this. He says, that Herron was one of these bad boys who seemed to be too impatient with architecture in the 60s and was marching out into uncharted territory that may have been extra architectural territory. He immediately says that is the wrong way to see Herron. That is the wrong way to see architecture. But in fact, Herron residential architect because he draws, because he is committed to the architectural act of designing. So in his very late essays, Banham keeps coming back to the idea that architecture is a fairly limited mode of design that has its roots in Renaissance Italy, and everything that doesn't have its roots in Renaissance Italy kind of is an architecture. That, you know, all of the stuff that NAB is shoehorning into various history curricula, Banham would say that it's not architecture. You know, like, or there's a very solid argument to say that that is not architecture. And if we try to, in the ways that we try to cram every kind of construction on the crust of the planet into the portfolio of architecture, architecture becomes unmanageable, and all of those other modes of design become compromised. Like, this is the wrong way to deal with them. So at the end of his life, he tries to draw an incredibly narrow definition of architecture, and he winds up drawing it so narrow that buildings aren't part of it. That architecture is really determined by method as opposed to object. And so architecture beyond building really has to do with that. But if we go with Banham, and I think he's right on this, and I realized that I had been kind of writing along these lines in different ways while I was working on the text, but that to really understand that architecture and building are two different things, and a commitment to the discipline is not necessarily a commitment to building. And I believe this to be true, I believe this to be defensible philosophically, and I believe this to be Banham's position. And I believe both Banham and I are very uncomfortable with leaving building out of the equation. And so Banham's, what he calls his other tradition in modern architecture, which doesn't fit his definition of high tech very well, which doesn't seem to follow his own rules, becomes a way to kind of valorize again building. And so the possibility that he sketches out is that there is a mode of building that is perfectly viable. And the building, I think, that illustrates this best is another by Norman Foster. It's the Willis Faber and Dumas building in Ipswich, which, if you look at the way it's made, and you look at the way it's inside somewhere, there was a prettier photograph of the IBM building that the designer insisted on using for the cover. She was right, by the way. But the idea that it might be possible to think a kind of building that isn't encumbered by architecture. And what happens in Banham's writing again and again is the architecture does disappear. And you'll see it in his treatment of Philip Johnson's Glass House. You'll see it in his treatment of Foster's Ipswich building. That both of those buildings seem not to have any architecture in the conventional sense that he lays out at the end of his career. And what they have instead is interior design and landscaping. So if you go so architecture kind of melts, it fades into invisibility, leaving behind only its neighbor disciplines, which are normally seen as secondary, or often erroneously, I would say, seen as secondary. And so in a way, Banham is weirdly kind of elevating the status of interior design and landscape design in his attempt to kind of make sense of this incredible diversity of building arts. And so the distinction in those two chapters is really that if architecture is really, if we have to say what it is in one word, we would say it's a method as opposed to an object. And building is still an object, it's an object we need, and there may be a way to think it outside of the conventions of the discipline. And so he dies before he really ends that story. The last essay he wrote, The Black Box, A Secret History of Architecture, really tries to address this question. He defines an incredibly narrow definition. He says architecture is from masonry, it's held together by gravity, and its volumes are effectively closed. Anything that doesn't adhere to that tripartite formula isn't architecture. And this is an astonishing thing for Reyner Banham, the principal apologist for lunar landers and space labs and archograms, weird, plastic bags filled with stereo equipment as viable things to live in. That for Banham, who spent so much of his life seeming devoted to expanding the field, in fact arrives at the end of his life at the narrowest definition of architecture that you can imagine. And so it's those paradoxes that are really what drive the book, and I really think are what drive Banham's thinking. And I don't think they're really reflected in Banham's scholarship. I think, for the most part, this scholarship that exists on Banham so far really concentrates on the beginning of his life, where he's much more impatient with the traditions of the field. There's some fantastic writers. Whiteley's biography is really good. Tony Vidler's chapter in Historians of the Immediate Future is phenomenally good. Vidler stops at the LA book, leaving an entire half of Banham's career unexamined. And so, in a way, I've written a kind of, if Banham wrote a revisionist history of modernism with theory and design in the first machine age, what I set out to do here was write a revisionist history of Banham, which is more, which looks at the entire corpus as opposed to just the first half, which I think scholarship to date really does.
Just a couple of things, Todd, I wanted to push you on there. One of you mentioned that final triad that he advocates, and could you go through, would you talk a little bit, that's either the second or the third kind of 3 rules that you have to live by pronouncements that Banham made in the course of his life, and he did it because he felt he had seen others effectively promulgate their notions of what modernism ought to be with a similar kind of trio.
Yeah, I mean, there's different, and I go through this, and there's several charts in the book that I kind of lay out these various tripartite definitions of modernism. I may not be able to remember them all off the top of my head, but so Alfred Barr, and if you read The International Style by Hitchcock and Johnson, Alfred Barr actually gives you a much more precise tripartite definition. It's reflected in the chapters of that book.
And it's, I think, illustrated by Porsche to a certain degree still.
Well, so Barr, The International Style is primarily an aesthetic understanding that architecture is from what he calls planar volumes, irregular massing, and blank surfaces. Like, that's it, those 3 things. If you go to Nicholas Pevsner in Pioneers of the Modern Movement, he says, he does it historically, and he says that architecture is basically the shotgun marriage of Victorian engineering, Art Nouveau, and the arts and crafts movement. Put those things together, stir them up, modernism comes out. Siegfried Gideon gives you a tectonic definition of architecture, of modern architecture, which is architecture is steel, glass, and concrete. And you get this most clearly in his first book, Bowen and Frank Reich. And so Banham looks at those, and then throughout his career, he starts with the New Brutalism. The New Brutalism is 3 things. It's as-found materials, exposed structure, and memorability as an image. That's it. He moves to clip-on. He has a tripartite definition. He gets to high-tech. High-tech is bold colors, exposed structure, and exposed mechanical surfaces. And then he moves on to architecture. It's masonry, gravity, enclosure. And then his final one is and this is where it somehow applies to both architecture and modernism simultaneously. So he's doing a whole bunch of things at the same time, and I know I'm going really fast. And I also realize this entire conversation is like serious inside baseball. And I promise it's not quite so arcane, laid out over 75,000 words. But his final definition of modernism, which he writes in the catalog essay for a show on the case study houses, is clarity, honesty, and unity. That's really, as you can see again, like Banham becoming incredibly traditional, incredibly conventional. And with those late writings in mind, you go back to the early writings and realize he was he was like that at the beginning too. And so there's a strange slant to the way Banham, I think, has been personified. And it's not to say that those other definitions are wrong. It's just to say that everybody is, there's always more there. There's always another description that is viable and available. And so I don't set out in the book to say Vidler got it wrong, or Whiteley got it wrong, or Tony Otis got it wrong, but rather that to agree with Banham that there are multiple Banhams, just like there are multiple everybody. And so we could think this whole business of how many hats you wear. There's 3 or 4 Joes, there's 3 or 4 me's, and to try to find a way to write, which I think Banham was doing, and in a way I was trying to echo, to try to find a way to write history that isn't so determined to find the answer, but rather to find a way that you can hold multiple versions of the same story in suspension, which I think is how the world works. I think if we have to reduce everything to one system, you have to exclude and politically it's totally pernicious, but it's also just wrong and less interesting. And so I think a big part of the sort of writerly ambitions here is that. It's like, how do you hold in suspension these kind of multiple definitions?
That seems, it seems like one of the really compelling roles Banham plays is both, it is again a kind of both-end role of being a protagonist in the late modern hashing out of the rules of 3 and what the present needs to be about. And on the other hand, through enacting that process a few times over, and by having Catholic tastes that are sometimes in conflict with one another, becoming something else.
Right.
I just point out that in Clement Greenberg and Michael, at the same time these arguments are happening in architecture, similarly doctrinaire rules are getting set up for fine artists. And it's interesting in a broader discussion of how formalism kind of evolves to look at the two disciplines together. I'll be quick, Todd, but I wanted to try to, if you don't mind closing with looking at these buildings. These are the 2 buildings that Banham cites in 1988. And I was interested in architecture for automobiles that's played out since then. There's actually been quite a bit of contemporary architecture for automobiles. And I'd be curious, Todd, to see how you sort of read the possibilities of some of these projects. I'll put on my glasses and we'll wrap up. But after these two, Porsche would go on to build the Porsche Museum in 2007, a German firm of Deligen and Meissel. And Ferrari would similarly build a museum designed by Maximiliano Fuchsas and Future Systems. I actually think 2014 is when it reopens, but these 2 buildings seem to kind of echo Banham's dialectic. The Porsche box is starting to get slightly more modeled. The Ferrari roofscape has become something closer to an auto body than its suspension system, but the kind of amplified metaphor there is, I think, parallel.
Well, the big deal there is that one is silver and one is yellow, and exactly like Porsche and Renault. So it's the same yellow. It's funny that Ferrari and Renault would use the same yellow.
It is, and it was Fiat that bought Ferrari. I was wondering if it was actually corporate kinship, but the opposite. I think, and this was the one I sort of jumped to, Todd, as you were talking about Banham's early work. But one of the things that happens in a lot of the new architecture for automobiles, and I should say that to me this is, possibly the other side of his argument in architecture, a building without architecture, a building beyond architecture. To some degree, these buildings for automobiles are as much for the cars as for the people, and I think it's this precedent that starts to become resurgent in the next couple of buildings. You have that one, and then you have BMW Welt by Kurt Himmelblau in 2007, where the racetrack is coursing through the building and becoming actually the narrative structure for the automotive museum. The line of that track is the history. Similarly, here, not a racetrack, but a parking helix, this time multiplied 3 times after the model of the Guggenheim, starts to structure the narrative here. I guess in those 2, Todd, I wonder about the issue of scale. That if in Banham's look at technology, often technology is scaled up to become buildings, that in the 2000s, in the contemporary discussion of technology, often a one-for-one sampling of infrastructure, the parking helix of the racetrack, becomes the architectural expression.
And that may be the way that I would characterize this. You know, if the Fiat factory in some way is infrastructure, you know, architecture becoming infrastructure in a way, here you have it much more. And so again, almost, if an interesting result of the seeming drive toward invisibility in architecture, you know, so technology makes things disappear, would be the argument, right? So think of the telephone you had 40 years ago, right, or 20 years ago, or 3 months ago, you know, like the last version of these things. The technology generally makes things disappear, is what Banham's argument is. And it's like, the more technology we push into architecture, architecture is going to vanish. And so if we look at that in terms of Ipswich or the Glass House, architecture vanishes, leaving behind landscape and interior design. What's interesting about the way that you set this up is kind of like, if we push it in a different way, architecture could begin to vanish, leaving behind only infrastructure. And you know, the kind of infrastructure of roads and circulation becomes the whole thing. And I mean, it's not a totally worked out story, but
I think the dialectic reasserts itself, though. In these two buildings, I do think there's still, in the way the spiraling works in blah blah blah, you see an abstraction and a stylization of the impulse to imagine a car passing through that space. In the VW parking tower, you have the very literal technological placement of the automobiles becoming the architectural expression.
Right.
And I think to Banham's point, you can still see things in those terms. I think where it gets complicated for me, and this is, I think Zaha and Zaha Hadid, importantly, of the architects, kind of comes of age just as Reyner comes to general knowledge and of age.
She enters the field as he leaves it.
Yeah, as he's leaving it. And I think this building sets up a different set of questions about how architecture and automobiles relate to one another. Yeah. I think the whole question of architecture as a scenography that can encapsulate the automobile or advanced technology rather than echoing it is different.
My guess is that Banham would really like these buildings, insofar as, you know, the height. He kept coming back to these cars, buildings for cars. But they were really symbolic, right? You know, whether you go with the Porsche aesthetic or the Renault aesthetic, like those two buildings were really symbolizing the car in some way. And the idea that, you know, each of the buildings you're demonstrating kind of increasing accommodation of the car, that how cars move becomes a design strategy as opposed to it still has kind of symbolic or representational connotations. But I think that blurring of you know, a building that is designed to accommodate automobiles as much as it's designed to accommodate human beings. I think, you know, it starts to sound a little like some arguments associated with object-oriented ontology and post-humanism and making an architecture that has more to, you know, that's accommodating more constituencies more effectively. So it's too bad Banham's not around to kind of comment on some of these things, because I think he was at a point where his thinking was really changing, or his thinking had really kind of crystallized in a way that his earlier work wasn't quite there. And speaking of crystals.
Yeah, and I'm realizing this is a project that the economics of which are automotive at this point. This is a house we finished a few years ago. Its property taxes have been paid 3 out of the last 5 years by auto ads. Cadillac and a Jeep ad.
Oh, filming them there.
Yeah, and so this house has become more a kind of lighting system for automobiles than, more frequently and more profitably, a lighting system for automobiles than a habitation for people. But
I rest my case.
But please.
So it's getting late.
It is.
Any questions? Were we sufficiently confusing?
Yeah, I'm sorry to, but I think I brought most of the confusion. Todd's book is fantastic.
Valid.
Should I wait a second?
Yeah, you can give us a second.
I'm a big fan of Banham's position on archigram because it seems to constitute the sort of third side where it's not performance, right? It's sort of the fiction of performance. And there's a kind of cultural zeitgeist that comes along with it, with the whole space age aesthetics, so the whole idea of the Hollander, which is performance and aesthetics. But I don't think that the work of archigram actually fits into either category, right? Or maybe I'm just misreading it, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about how the idea of the fiction of performance actually ties into Banham's thinking. Or
Well,
the image.
I would say image is maybe the more correct term than fiction, but Banham again and again and again, he would constantly come back that the image has to prevail in a way. So that's why archigram wins over centric price. That's why, in a sense, architecture wins over performance. That, again and again, you have to have that visual component. There are these incredible essays that he wrote late in his life on high tech, where he begins to equate buildings like Renault with sailing ships. And he talks about the rigging on sailing ships and maritime superstition and things like that. And the thing that you begin to understand when you look at sailing ships is, in spite of they're supposedly deeply functionalist and they only have what's absolutely necessary, that there's an incredible amount of superstition involved in the way that they're organized, in the way that they're laid out. That a lot of it is there because of the tradition of maritime life. And he sees that that's the same thing going on in a lot of these high-tech buildings. So if you look at, say, Charles and Ray Eames' house in Los Angeles, right, has X-bracing that you would normally need in a steel frame building. Turns out you don't need the X-bracing on the Eames house, but Charles Eames insisted that it be there because it looked better with the X-bracing. Norman Foster, when Foster and Rogers were teamed up as Team 4, and they did a building for Reliance Controls, they put X-bracing all over the thing where they didn't need it. Their engineer went berserk. But then they built a tower that was trying to be a kind of POMO citation of the tower at the Smithson's Hunstanton School. The tower desperately needed X-bracing. Foster wouldn't allow it because there was no X-bracing on the Smithson's. And so, this image that there's a functional story, but then it's reinforced with excessive stuff. And so, I'm not totally sure that I'm answering your question, but this might shed a little more.
Just a brief point to the archigram questions. I think Todd does a wonderful job of both discussing archigram as a collective endeavor that creates a body of work, and looking at the individual voices within archigram and seeing where their trajectories differ from that collective project in the 60s. And I think it's again an instance where the singular and the plural kind of coexist in the architecture Banham wants to challenge, and the way I think he sees architecture confronting the future, that it's going to be both a collective endeavor and kind of singular visions. Right. And I think that touches a little bit on something we haven't tonight at all. It came up a little bit as we were talking about at lunch, which is politics, that Banham's writing in an incredibly charged period in European, American, and in fact, he's writing through. Banham is, among other things, really the diarist of the Cold War in our field, And you know, arguably, I was struck in that initial comparison that he picks the two fighters that won World War II, the U.S. and the British airplanes, and actually the whole term, as Dave mentioned again, the boffin goes back to that World War II legacy. That I think in some ways Banham's project is to take the consequences of that victory, the complicated consequences of that victory, and try to imagine what it means for our field, and what the 60s how the 60s would reassess that sense of victory.
Are we done? Sounds like
something, but I'm thinking, because I was thinking that this phrase high tech, it sounds kind of old fashioned. Right?
It is old fashioned.
You wouldn't really say high tech.
Deeply old fashioned.
Yeah. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, like, since Banham died, basically, how would you see the kind of cultural relationship to technology shifting? Like, does it still sort of map on, let's say, in terms of these two categories? Or maybe are these, like, less useful? Because I'm looking at these two buildings, and I'm thinking, also looking at your computer, and I'm thinking, like, Apple and Mack, right? So, like, one which is sort of modular, low barrier of entry, cheap, and one which is, like, super sleek, smooth, and expensive, right? And so I'm wondering if you could sort of, it's not really a question, but if you could sort of talk about how the cultural relationship to technology is shifting.
I think it's something that we have all had to grapple with quite dramatically as architects over the last, say, 30 years. Banham was writing at a time where, I don't like this phrasing, but it's the most accurate I can think of at the moment. Indexical legibility was kind of a given. You know, that when you looked at a thing, you knew you could read how it operates. So when you look at a car, you understand the relationship between the wheel, the ground, and the fender, right? When you look at a Greek temple, you understand the relationship between the columns and the entablature, right? That you can figure out something visually based on how it's organized. Sure. But then in a world filled with objects like this, you know, indexical legibility of function is just gone, right? That kind of mechanical causality, which really seems to underlie the visual language of a lot of these. It doesn't matter which one, you know, like they all have a very clear mechanical explanation. And so Banham was writing, it was in some ways the last gasp of that kind of mechanically legible visual language. And so how to deal with something like this? Because this would, in some ways, a phone would fall into the high-tech category. It looks a lot like the Porsche cigarette lighter that Banham spends a lot of time writing about in the essay that's in this book. So, but I think for me that's really the crux of it, is that if we find ourselves going back to the idea of legible, mechanical, part-to-whole relationships, we can't help but be old-fashioned. Like, that's a deeply old-fashioned way to think about objects. And it's not that parts and wholes don't exist anymore, but that a whole new class of objects have entered the world, taken over the world, that just, they don't care about that, those distinctions anymore. And so part of the problem for us now is, like, you know, these categories maybe don't work so well, that these are historical categories as opposed to contemporary ones.
Would you say that those interfaces that were provided by what you're calling kind of indexical legibility just kind of get instantiated on the fly? Like, you need an object like that?
Kind of, but I think they get instantiated in a different way.
I mean, I know they're different, right? But
so I would put it like, you know, Banham, in the same essay he's talking about the sailing ships, he invokes Horatio Greena's definition of beauty. And so in a very incredible 3 or 4 lines in this text that I can't remember the name of right now, Greena said, he says, beauty is the promise of function. Then he goes on to say, action is the presence of function, and character is the record of function. So, and Banham really loved this definition. He's like, this blows the doors off of Sullivan's form follows function, which is true. I mean, it's a much smarter and I think more useful way to think about the relationship of action and objects. But there is something about it that the entire thing is built into function in a way that it's a super functionalist definition of beauty and character.
And so, like looking at these four things, because I think that the Porsche building is the odd one out. Like I look at the ski boot and say that it belongs more with the other two in terms of its exuberance and its desire to communicate. Like those three things, the boot, the bike, and the Foster building, have a kind of excessive communication. They're there to be received, whereas the Porsche building may be communicating something, but it's very reticent, it's somewhat indifferent.
Yeah. You can parse this set of images in a lot of ways, and I think maybe we're in danger of making too much out of it. I mean, this was a draft introduction that Banham wrote. He wrote, his cover letter made it clear he wasn't done. So he was someone who revised pretty aggressively from draft to draft. So it's not clear that this set of comparisons would have made it into the final form. And so there's always a danger that we're kind of making too much out of it. I think the way Joe flipped it over, and like this is actually a super techie boot, and Banham just didn't know enough about skiing. I think that's true. And historians make mistakes, just like everybody.
True, but maybe pedantic. He does talk a little bit about that Porsche building as a kind of as a rather ingenious neutral envelope for a complicated set of programmatic needs that had certain adjacencies. I was interested in the later buildings we looked at about how those become a circuitry where in the later buildings the organization is overtaken by a diagram that isn't in any way evident in the architecture of this building, but I think in our field in the last 30 years has been hugely important.
Okay, so now we're after 7 o'clock. Will you release us? I was so wanted to be done.